Welcome to the CentreCourt MBA Festival in Washington, D.C. We're in Union Station. We couldn't be any easier to get to for the next 3-4 hours. And as you know, it's both an event to come and meet schools face-to-face, but we're streaming all of the panels at the event, and we always start with the committee. And the idea of the committee is to actually look at some of the typical profiles that you will see applying to business schools, and some of the strengths and weaknesses of those applicants and what they maybe could do to improve their chances of admission. So to discuss 5 or 6 of those profiles that we've put together today, I'm joined by Kyle McDonald, who is the Director of Specialized Masters and PhD Programs at Boston University's Questrom School of Business, and Kelly Wilson, who is the Executive Director of Master's Programs at Carnegie Mellon Tepper. You managed to pull yourself away from your wonderful new building for the afternoon and join us here.
I did, yes.
So I guess we'll get started and we'll pull up the first profile. And if you're watching this, we're going to be in New York on Saturday. Feel free to send in your profile so that the committee on Saturday afternoon can take a look at your profile. So can we move to the first candidate slide? I need a clicker, or I should have memorized all of these, right? Ah, there we go. Yeah, it was going to be in my hands, the committee.
Magically appear.
Okay, so we start with Amy. So Big Four, wanting to head to a McKinsey, Bain, or a BCG. Her background among the Big Four, she spent the last years at PwC, made it to a senior associate position. And before that, Deloitte. I mean, if she keeps going, she could add KPMG and EY to the list, right? Some target schools, certainly some of the local schools in and around DC, Kellogg, and London Business School for an international dimension. Went to the University of Richmond, 3.3 GPA, and has taken the GMAT, got a 710 with a Quant 66. So Kyle, let's start with you. What do you like about Amy's profile?
You know, the first thing that's kind of, speaking to me is her experience. You know, she certainly does have, some experience in the consulting industry already. You know, consulting is a very popular, kind of employment track for a lot of MBA graduates. And so having that experience and being able to parlay that, into her application, I see one of her recommenders is from Deloitte. And so that's helpful in kind of giving the committee, assuaging any concerns that they might have about consulting, because it is a competitive field to get into. So we want to make sure that, Amy, aside from getting the MBA and getting that degree, has the tools that she needs to get herself to that next step.
Right, got it. Now, Kellogg is now at a record 732 with the GMAT LBS, I think is 709. So she's got a GMAT score that's in the range. Kelly, when you're looking at GMAT scores, it's easy to get stuck on an average for a school, but you're then also looking at the breakdown and what that could indicate. Anything that you pick up from this 710 and the breakdown of her scores?
Yeah, I think one of the elements that we're going to look at is the quantitative score. We want to make sure that she can be successful in the academics of the program. And so in addition to the overall score, the quantitative score is important for her. I think in terms of her success with schools that may have a higher average GMAT than hers, she needs to just step back and think about the different elements of her application and where she might strengthen. And remember that there is a range of scores, and the average is just that. And so there are very, very few applicants who come to the table with all of the different elements of their application right at the average. Right. So she may have some strengths that she's going to want to demonstrate for the benefit of the committee, right, that might not initially show up. Right. With the data points.
Yeah. Kyle, you were talking about, obviously this is part of a well-represented pool of the Big Four. How can someone like Amy then sort of pull on what she's been doing in the community to further strengthen any patterns of leadership and really stand out in that well-represented pool?
Certainly. You know, I think that, she's got some, volunteer experience. And I think aside from just listing that on a resume, really utilizing her essay to speak to the experiences that she's had and the leadership that she's had and how the skills are transferable. She may not have had, the opportunity to, lead certain projects in her current employment, and so, kind of speaking to that volunteer experience, and it's hard to say how involved it is, but if it is, really utilizing the essay, maybe having an additional recommendation from someone at the American Cancer Society who can speak to the value that she has brought to their organization.
Okay. Well, as a possible idea, she's talking about getting a recommendation from a boss from her previous position at Deloitte. Would she be better served, Kelly, to now approach somebody at PwC to reflect where she is today? Or would bringing in a voice, if the role that she'd played at the American Cancer Society had been of real substance, would that be an interesting alternative?
Yeah, it could be. If it's a meaty experience that she's had with the American Cancer Society, it could be relevant. I think I would lean toward the current role. What we'll be able to see there is the experience or the observation of her experience at Deloitte, and then as she's progressed in consulting, hopefully we'll see some strengths in areas that will benefit her overall. I don't think it's necessarily a bad option to get the American Cancer Society. It just depends. And that's something that I think we can say a lot about a given applicant is there are choices to make, and depending on what they want to put forward, what the applicant wants to put forward as a strength or to bolster a part of their application, I think either or could work. My advice would be to go for the one at PwC.
Right, so strong competitive profile, and now for her in the application process to really find that substance and how she shares that story. Great, now so that's Amy from the Big Four. This was local, you might imagine, to DC. So Dennis, a Peace Corps advisor who's targeting Fuqua, Yale, and MIT Sloan, okay? He's been advising in the agribusiness sector in the last couple of years, and an associate for Action Against Hunger. Now, certain individuals, you look at Action Against Hunger, and for many that might be the extracurricular or volunteer work for a consultant or software engineer, whereas this is actually part of Dennis's day job, right? So when you have that sort of level of societal engagement, does it then diminish what you would then need to show on the sort of extracurricular side, or just open up the avenue for other passions and interests? He was a student class president, spent some time studying in Latin America. Any thoughts on that, Kyle?
I don't think it changes, what we would be looking for in an extracurricular, experiences. And some schools look at those experiences differently. Some might put a heavier weight on things like that, and some might be really focused on the work history as opposed to the extracurricular experiences. So I think that it is good, the things that he has done with his work history. His extracurricular experiences, while it is commendable to be the class president and to study in Latin America, a lot of students have experiences like that.
Right.
So these experiences may not kind of bring as much to the table as our last candidate who seemed like she had a little bit more meat to the experience, but it's hard to say. But it could really go either way.
Right. Kelly, the idea, so he studied international business. There are already going to be maybe some quant-related courses on his transcript,
Yep.
And then solid numbers there. So good demonstration of the academic rigor that these schools would be looking for?
Yeah, so the quantitative score, the overall score, and the GPA all seem to be solid, strong.
Right.
And so I wouldn't have a concern necessarily about the rigor, but it is a little bit of a different ballgame, right? And so I think it could benefit any applicant to speak to their ability to handle quantitative coursework, even if they do have a little bit of a strength in it. And in particular, As an international business major, there are going to be some classes in there that I'm sure he can put forward as more evidence, especially since his employment history is not necessarily streamlined business. I'm sure he's doing many things that have transferable skills, but he may want to push forward just the strength in the academics to bolster his application kind of side by side with what he's doing employment-wise.
Right, and if we take what he would like to be doing employment-wise, as he comes out of business school, we're certainly seeing more and more applicants that are talking about social enterprise. Sloan, one example, I think they have an S-Lab that looks at for-profit business in the sort of social enterprise space. How well does that then sort of connect with a school when you've really talked about post-MBA career goals and kind of embed them with a core sort of strength of the school? Does that resonate to you when someone for Questrom or someone at Tepper has identified a key aspect of your program and it fits into where they're transitioning in their career? Kyle.
Certainly. You can tell when a candidate has done research on your institution. It really shows through an essay, through choice of maybe recommenders or post-MBA goals, because when we see an application that really just looks like a find and replace, you've taken out all the Teppers in the essay and replaced them with Questrom, we really can tell because the language, it just doesn't have the same kind of oomph. Right. As it would when it's written very very specifically for a school with a very specific kind of match of passions in mind.
Right. Now, forgive the British humour, but who is not in the Supreme Court these days with issues of sexual misconduct? So your boss is in trouble. Any advice around where Dennis might look for recommenders?
Who might be a better alternative?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe. Not necessarily a current boss, but maybe a previous supervisor or someone who, if the organization is a matrixed organization, someone he may have reported to for projects or kind of day-to-day work that wasn't necessarily his direct supervisor. I think in those cases, it would be helpful just to use the optional essay to explain why he's not getting a rec from his current boss.
Right.
Certainly doesn't have to go into much detail.
Yes.
Short and sweet will be great, but that's helpful to the committee to understand maybe why the direct supervisor is not being asked.
Right. So just make sure all of those things are, imagination can be a powerful thing. Great. So clearly sort of alignment with the schools that he's chosen, and Kelly, this idea of doing a good job to show where his quant skills lie, maybe thinking a little harder around some of his extracurriculars, because as you said, Kyle, those are things that would be easily replicated by other applicants. Great, so there's Dennis. Now we have Sarah, who works in business data intelligence, targeting another set of the top schools, both here in the US, Canada, and Fontainebleau. 8 years with US Postal, which I guess is a lot of supply chain, global intelligence team handling masses of data. Which I guess would be consistent with the sort of role she might imagine at Amazon. Did international business, strong GPA. Now she's opted for the GRE. Have schools really adopted and embraced the GRE? Is it a good alternative to the GMAT?
I think it certainly is something to think about. I always encourage candidates who maybe didn't have a undergraduate business experience to look into the GRE. They may find it more helpful in terms of the way that concepts are presented. I would say though that for some specific industries, they are certainly looking more for a GMAT score than a GRE score. But certainly with schools, I would encourage candidates to ask because we each handle those very differently. So in our case, we accept both and we don't convert one to the other. We kind of look at them on a level playing field, but we understand what is the kind of target score that's going to show success in our programs.
Right. Let's imagine, we don't know this, Kelly, but let's imagine 8 years with US Postal, which came out of school 8 years ago. So your career with one organization, you're then presumably trying to show growth within that
Yes.
organization.
Yeah, I think a misstep applicants sometimes make is to put only the most recent or the highest position they've held at an organization. And in particular, if you've worked with an organization for a number of years, we do like to see that you've started out in an entry-level role and you've received promotions within the organization. If you only put your most recent position, you're really cheating yourself out of some rich material that the admissions committee can consider.
Right, right. Now, among the choice of schools, so Harvard and Stanford on the list, of course, it's always great to have someone that's been to business school to write one of the recommendations. They're familiar with the whole process. Is there a downside, Kyle, to the HBS alum who maybe talks about sort of heroic individualism in Boston, and that Kirsten's team on the West Coast says, well, yeah, that is great for a school like Harvard. It doesn't sort of connect with us, and that that HBS alum would sort of undermine her chances at a school like Stanford.
I think it's certainly something to think about. Although I guess it would depend on what the recommender is saying as part of that recommendation. Because if it reads very heavily, she's a great fit for HBS. I can think the other 5 schools on that list are not going to look too kindly on that. I think that it would really depend on if Sarah had other people that she could turn to that maybe would carry as much weight as her current supervisor. I imagine that she's had progression, and so I imagine that she's had other team members or other folks that she's reported to that she could ask. But I think it might be worth having a conversation with her recommender to prime him or her to really, if what she wants to do is use that recommendation for all the schools she's applying to, really prime them and say, look, I would like you to focus on these things for this certain institution and these things for this certain institution.
Right, because we're typically asking busy individuals to write those recommendations, and the schools have gathered around a fairly sort of core template, but just this idea of maybe a nuance that would speak to a collaborative culture at the GSB or an international dimension at a school like INSEAD, just to sort of connect with the cultures of each of those schools.
Yeah, if I could just add, if you don't mind, I think alumni are some of the most passionate people I know, and I do think it might be a good idea for Sarah to talk to her boss and maybe ask him just to pull back a little when he's writing, or maybe write 2 separate kind of formats in the recommendation, one for HBS and one not for HBS,
right.
Because he could put more, he or she, the boss, could put more specific HBS content based on his experience and what he knows toward the HBS, and then the others, as Kyle was saying, kind of pull back a little.
Right. I love these sessions because we get into the real nitty-gritty of what candidates face. She did take the GRE. I think the quant score might want to go up. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I did want to bring up, whether it's Minds Matter or Big Brother, Big Sister, some organizations nationwide. Again, the point that you made, Kelly, of not just relying on the most recent job title, going beyond volunteer and really showing what the impact that you've had in that volunteer work.
Yes. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I could give is, remember this is an exercise of reflection. So the committee wants to not only know what you've done, but what you've gotten out of it, what you think you've contributed to the lives of others. And it goes back to that impact, right? And so, whether it's writing your resume or addressing in your essays the impact that you had on someone's life through the Big Brother, Big Sister organization, or the impact they had on your life. I think that really makes an applicant human, and it allows the admissions committee to connect with them a little bit more.
Right, great. So there's Sarah. Caitlin, an ethics investigator, applying locally to Georgetown, also to Stern. And I think that I've completely left off any of her employer. I'll hold my hand up for that one. Her future career goals, financial crime professional at an international bank. This is going to stand out, right? Among all of those investment bankers and consultants, to be looking at financial crime with the numbers to back it up. If that story was so compelling and providing that sort of diversity to the diversity that you look to craft in the classroom, Are you going to forgive the GMAT on this one, Kyle?
That's a tough one. We have a holistic application review process. I think every school is going to tell you that, and it is not just a buzzword. We really are looking at every single thing that you submit as part of your application. Certainly, financial crime. It's a very niche specific role at a bank, and I think we'd want to make sure that we're setting Caitlin up for success. The last thing we want to do is to admit a student to a program who may not be successful in the academic experience or the career search process. And so, Caitlin may have only taken the GMAT once. It looks like she has a lower quantitative score, and especially someone who's looking to work in finance after the program. I would encourage her to maybe think about retaking the exam, and her GPA is quite strong. Maybe utilizing the optional essay to speak to her quantitative experiences, and speak to if that it really is her GMAT score, why the committee, she wants to assuage some of the committee's concerns. It's certainly, at some schools might be a deal breaker, and at some it might be a little bit of a larger conversation.
Right. Now, if you had $1 for every time somebody said, I don't test well in that optional essay, here she has to bite the bullet, right? Because there's a great story to share, and with the academics at Michigan State, but she needs to find a way to drive up that quant score, to the point that Kyle spoke to.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kyle. I think the little bit of a disconnect is the quant score is low. She has a finance background, and so I imagine there's some quantitative coursework in there. And so there is a disconnect as to why maybe the preparation wasn't there, maybe the way she prepared. And so I think just kind of if she has the opportunity to step back and think about what the story looks like from the perspective of her preparedness for graduate level quantitative coursework in particular, but graduate level coursework.
And maybe we can jump on that in terms of round 1 versus round 2 or round 3. Far better served to take that time, take the study time if that's what it was missing, to then deliver an application in a later round than to sort of hurry to be one of the first ones that you look at, right?
Yeah, I'm sure we all have a version of saying what I'm about to say. My recommendation is apply as early as you can, as long as it's the strongest application that you can pull together. Otherwise, it is a better idea to wait till the next round.
Right, great. Let's see, who have we got next? We couldn't resist with this one. So Donnie, who works in real estate, targeting some of the Harvard, Columbia, Kellogg, and Darden. So he's been working 5 years in a family business in real estate development, but he wants to use business school to make a transition into media and leisure. That might be what, casinos or a primetime television show? Well, he was at 2 years at Fordham and then transferred to Wharton to get his economics degree. He hasn't taken the GMAT, but claims to have a very high IQ. Hosts beauty pageants. I mean, he's quite a colourful character, this one, no? Would he be interesting to the schools?
He would certainly be interesting, but there's a lot of things that don't necessarily connect together. And so the challenge for Donnie is really trying to kind of sow the seeds of the story here, because the committee is going to look at the real estate experience, but he wants to go into media. He has a background in economics, beauty pageants. It's very all over the place.
Right. And before we push him into a life of public service, just in terms of having a family member, I mean, people do work in family businesses, fathers, aunts, brothers, sisters that could be writing those recommendations. Should they avoid that, or is just the way that family member should then approach that letter of recommendation?
Yeah, my advice is to avoid it altogether. I know very few parents who think poorly of their children, right? And so I can only imagine the recommendation letter my mom would write for me. It would be positive if that came out. I'm not quite sure how that came out. It would be really, really positive. But we're looking for an observation of you in the workplace without that bias that relatives, we have to imagine it exists, even if they try to remove it. I think one other thing I would just want to do in particular for candidates who can be colorful, social media is something that you should think about. We may check your Facebook account, your Twitter account, just to see what you've been up to. If you come across in the application with some interesting aspects.
Right.
That might just be something we do.
Right, so if he tweets frantically on a Sunday morning, that's something the school might pick up on.
We
Got it.
could,
Right.
just that's what you should keep in mind. It's out there for the public.
And just for the beauty pageants, we were discussing a candidate at CentreCourt on Saturday in Toronto of someone that came second in a Miss Philippines contest. And the concern, well, should they be sharing that with business school? I mean, Kyle, what, in terms of personal passions, hobbies, no limits, right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it provides some color to your application because certainly we never forget that there is a person on the other side of the application, and so I always encourage candidates with the things that you have control over. You can really tell your own story. Your recommendations, they're kind of out of your hands, your test scores, your transcripts. So really use your essay and your resume to kind of speak to your experience and to speak to your kind of your well-roundedness. And so I don't think that is out of the question. I think it's just about how you put that in your application. You wouldn't maybe necessarily send in a video of you in the pageant, but adding it to a resume or speaking to it in a supplemental essay might be helpful.
Right. And of course, we had tongue-in-cheek fun with this one. But just to that point of sort of post-MBA career goals, I mean, if you held all of your students to be doing after the MBA program what they had talked about in their applications, no one would graduate, would they? I mean, so what are you looking for? A sort of a degree of clarity or coherence based on previous background?
Yeah, absolutely. We do ask for a post-MBA career goal, recognizing that it's very unlikely that's what an individual will end up doing, because when you get to business school, you'll be exposed to all kinds of things that you haven't yet thought about. And so it's important for us to know that you've taken the time to consider a plausible path, that you've been able to connect the dots between what you've done and what you want to do. For us to know that you have done that work gives us the confidence that when you get to school and things are going very fast, because once you arrive, it seems almost like the next day you're in front of a recruiter. You want to make sure that you're doing that work early so you're not behind the 8 ball when you get to the MBA program that you decide to join.
Great. Well, thanks both of you for talking through some of these real and imaginary characters. Some of them are all too real. We'll be having our next committee session when we get to New York at 12:30 on Saturday. And much like some of the applicants here, do send in your profiles for the sort of discussion. Kyle, Kelly, thanks very much for taking us through these.
Thank you.
You're welcome.